Hi everyone, thank you for joining and thanks for having me. I'm Nadia. I work at a energy co-op called Southeast London Community Energy, and I run a program which looks at helping homeowners and landlords and tenants really figure out what they can do about making their homes greener and how to invest in greening their homes. And we have a team of retrofit coordinators who give that advice, and it's one-to-one and very tailored advice. So yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Charlie Baker. I'm a founder of Red Cooperative. We're a retrofit design and delivery cooperative with a side order of a bit of energy here and there. We've been going since 2014, having realised that we were spending way too long writing reports about doing something about climate change and nowhere near enough time actually doing something about it. Um, so here I am in a house being retrofitted because I'm on site today because we've got the plasters coming on Monday because the customer, despite me warning her not to have a retrofit done when she was heavily pregnant, went ahead with it anyway, and she's given birth 2 weeks early, so I've got a bit of a deadline. Oh, and I'd quite like to do the scenarios one at a time so we can actually focus and drill down into them. Top.
Yeah, that's great. Um, so I think if we start perhaps with the privately rented scenario, would that be okay with both of
It's the most difficult one.
you? Yeah. Um,
So I guess, yeah, just to kick off with, we work with obviously both tenants and landlords. Um, as Charlie mentioned, it is a really difficult one because there aren't many firstly, there's very little legislation in place that actually pushes this sector to decarbonize. Having said that, you probably will have heard of an energy performance certificate, and this is something that is needed for every house that is being rented out. So the energy performance certificate basically categorizes all homes into a level of how energy efficient they are, or how green they are, from A to G. And there are minimum standards that landlords have to meet when they're renting out these properties, and the government are over time bringing the minimum standards up. Although Charlie, I don't know how your feelings are about what the minimum standards currently are on private rented properties.
Yes. Well, the minimum energy efficiency standard, or MEES as it's called, is the only tool in the box to force landlords into doing something about the energy demand on their properties. And so for a private tenant, it is actually quite a challenge. And then to be fair to the private landlords, the other problem is that the landlord usually isn't the bill payer, which can create a bit of a problem because they're going to lavish all this money on the property. And this is the same for social landlords as well, that they put money into the property, but they don't get that money back. The occupant gets the money back. Now, obviously, housing association, social housing tenants sometimes discuss their landlords have ethical drivers that mean they want to make something happen. To reduce fuel poverty in their tenants, but private landlords it's much more difficult. Interestingly, I've been invited to address a forum, a national forum of private landlords in December. So I shall report back to you after that and see what they say. I think I'm quite keen on using finance to assist in this. That if we could create a regional lending capacity that was capitalised with patient enough finance to be cheaper than landlords could get by themselves, then they might be prepared to look at borrowing off that to improve their properties if the offers were right. And we wrote that up into a report we did for the West Yorkshire Combined Authority last year as to how they were going to get West Yorkshire's housing, all 985,000 properties, to zero carbon by 2038. So at least they got the right target, roughly. Um, but for a tenant inside a private landlord property, that is a lot more difficult. Obviously, there is asking the landlord politely, but with quite a lot of landlords, that doesn't work really, does it? There's obviously behaviour change stuff you can do, and depending on how energy is provided, you can look at So, well, I was going to say you could look at the Octopus Agile tariff, but don't even think about looking at it at the moment because it's broken. Because the gas prices are so high that it's 35p a kilowatt hour almost all of the day. But say, for example, the Go tariff of theirs, which is 4p from 12:30 to 4:30 in the morning. If you had things that you could run at that time, the rest of the time, it's not that expensive. It's not much more expensive than a lot of other tariffs. So you could save a bit of money that way. And obviously, the inferred offer, if not explicit and or implicit or whichever one it is,
Yeah.
is that there's lower carbon on that energy used overnight because there's less demand and therefore wind turbines are providing more of that energy. And the UK does have quite a good wind energy reserve. After that, there is then the appliances you use when you use them and all the other usual small bits and pieces that you can do. I've taken to putting individual mugfuls of water in the kettle these days.
It's a very good idea because it does save a significant amount of energy. The number of times you use your kettle in a day, there's no point boiling it to completely full. And using electricity to heat things is also quite a big draw of power in comparison to using other fuels to heat things. So when we're thinking about our electric appliances, our kettles, our stoves, if you've got electric heating as well, that's definitely something to consider. But just going back to these minimum energy efficiency standards that we were talking about, Charlie, I think another problem in the landlord space and in motivating landlords to do this work is that um, it's really down to local councils to monitor whether landlords are meeting those standards. And most of our councils are very underfunded. Most of our councils are a bit strapped for cash, and quite often they don't really employ anyone to make sure that landlords are meeting the standards. So that is the first sort of issue we've got here. Um, Having said that, there are opportunities for landlords to do things, and we do see quite a few landlords actually come forward to us um, to invest in their properties. And quite a few of the ones that have come to our Future Fit Homes program have been sort of social landlords who, they believe that making these investments are going to make it more comfortable for their tenant, and their home is going to be greener for the future, and that is the main driver. But all landlords, when they're investing in a rental property, their returns have got to be higher than what they're investing. And that is sort of the main motivation. As Charlie mentioned, there's no scope really to recoup the savings of this, because usually it is the tenant that's paying the energy bills and the tenant that is going to see those savings on their energy bills. So touching on that concept of finance, I think is a really great point. We've also been just researching what kinds of finance there are out there for landlords to tackle this. And you've got certain tools that we're starting to see pop up, like green mortgages, but they're very early stage. There's not many banks that are offering them. And they're not a great incentive as great incentive as we would hope they would be. We'll talk about sort of financial tools for other types of homes and homeowners, which is a really interesting one, dependent on what kind of individual you are. But yeah, just to say that tenants have got options. There are many things that you can do, and behavior change as well does make a significant impact. So Charlie was talking about different energy tariffs. Switching your suppliers is one of them. I wouldn't recommend switching right now, because you will all have heard in the news that we're seeing lots of smaller energy suppliers go bust. It's just really hard to get through to energy suppliers at the minute, and they're super busy switching the people over from the companies that have gone bust to different companies. So I would wait a few months until the market settles down to actually take that action. But you can also look into what we would call light measures. And at CELSI, when we give out energy advice, we also give out some of these light measures for free. So it's looking at really thinking about the kind of house you live in and thinking about what you can constructively do. So one of the big places we lose heat from, or I'll break it down into the place we lose heat from the most first is the roof. As a tenant, you can't really go and install loft insulation if you haven't got any. Then you're looking at windows and doors. This is something that tenants can look at. So if you've got windows that have big gaps around the edges, you can try and fill those in. If you've got doors that have got big gaps under them that are letting the heat out, you can go and put a door brush or some kind of insulation to close up those gaps, and that will make a significant difference to your draft. So for example, under my stairs, I've got a terrible old door and it's constantly drafty. I can feel the wind coming out from under the floor, under the stairs. So just sealing that up with a really cheap measure does make a significant difference to the warmth of the house. You've also got measures like putting aerators on your taps. Usually you can actually access these for free from the company that sends you your water bill. You just have to ask about all of these things. Water saving shower heads. You can put an appliance in your toilet cistern so that it uses less water every time you flush your toilet. And you can install radiator reflectors. So there's lots you can be thinking about that are small DIY measures. You don't, with retrofit, you don't have to go the whole way. We've got a huge task on our hands, and it's great if we can go the whole way, but every little counts, and everything that you can look at in terms of reducing your energy consumption does make a big difference.
I'll just lob in a wild card here, and I'll watch Nadine's eyebrows as Nadia's eyebrows. Sorry, as I say this. So one of the I mentioned it in a paper for the Tyndall Centre 8 years ago, and it's gradually maturing. But basically, battery storage is the next big thing. It's the thing that will enable renewables to work, because it'll take the intermittency of renewables and make them available when you need them. I was just about to say mittent, but that's not the opposite of intermittent, is it? Sorry, I was at a 17-year-old's party last night. It's a bit fluffy today. But one of the things we've been researching is virtual power plant operators require about 600 batteries before you can have your own module on them. They charge quite a lot of overhead for participation in that. However, they agree with me that the figures that we've put together working with what was formerly Upside Energy and is now bizarrely named Kraken Flex is that you can make between 60 and 80 pounds a year per kilowatt hour of storage. And so in this introductory conversation to this landlord last night, I was suggesting that actually, if you were a landlord with a reasonable sized portfolio, or you could team up with other smaller landlords with smaller portfolios, then you would be able to enter into that market. You would need to start the negotiations with your VPP of choice first. That's a virtual power plant operator first, but you would then be able to start to get to a trading quantity on that market. It's complicated and does require clever people with lots of computers and fueled by pizza in darkened rooms with servers whirring away in the background. But it's there. It's just a question of us getting enough volume up to be able to do that. And I talked about the same issue at the Confederation of Cooperative Housing Conference last week, just a short circuit and wriggle back into the scenario for the housing cooperators. That actually, for example, the Merseyside Federal Housing Co-ops has got 1,400 properties in its members. There is the possibility. It's all very much still a young game, but if we're not quick, obviously shareholder capital will dive in there and steal the territory from us. And so it's a good time to get mutual cooperative and ethical models in there. And so Nadia, if you've got any intelligence on that you'd like to share, or if we can work together on this, I'm trying to build a community of interest around this, because I've learnt my way around all of the various bits of regulatory framework, but it's quite complicated.
Yeah, and I think that is, you've probably hit the nail on the head there. It is quite complicated. And the reason it's complicated is not because the technical solutions are not there. It's just because the way that our energy system is currently set up, the way that laws are set up and legislation is set up around energy supply and who can sell energy to consumers and how consumers can share energy, is a very, very complex area.
I know, but I'm not talking about retail sales. This is peer-to-peer. This is trading on the day ahead and within day trading markets, which are far more relaxed in the regulation. And in fact, once you've got to a megawatt of storage, you've then met the critical threshold to be able to enter into the balancing mechanism, which is how the national grid keeps the lights on. Oh yes, I wouldn't dream of treading anywhere near the retail market. They're dropping like flies in that one. But the other side of it, that if you've got energy, actual energy to sell, rather than just white labeling someone else's, then it's actually, it does look like that is the place to go. Currently, there's only incomes to be made from local flexibility services, but the national ones will be available from February.
It's really interesting. So what we have found from sort of our research in flexibility services, and I think we're sort of venturing more into energy, heavy energy market stuff rather than retrofit here. So I'll keep it short
Well, it can fund
sweet.
retrofit. Sorry to interrupt, but the reason I was suggesting it to this landlord yesterday was that if she had an income derived from something that we put a threshold onto. So, for example, if we created a specifically retrofit VPP or got somebody to white label one for us, and we were able then to say to private landlords, you can have some of this cash. However, a condition on this cash is that you deploy some of it as debt redemption on a loan to do some retrofit, so that you can create carrots rather than hope that the government creates sticks.
Yeah,
Sorry to
it's
interrupt.
no, that's a really interesting point. And to be honest, the last time that we sort of looked into the space of flexibility markets, the margins weren't quite there for us to look at it. But having said that, that was 2 or 3 years ago, and I realized that cost of battery prices have gone down, flexibility markets have changed. There's lots of new sort of players in that space, so it's a really interesting one to look at. But yeah, I think there definitely needs to be more research done around how landlords can be incentivized rather than just chased with a stick to do retrofit. And I think that's a really good point. I realize that we have spent quite a lot of time on landlords and tenants. I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, out of interest, everyone who's watching in the chat, I'm just wondering what sort of position you guys are in. If you can let us know, are you sort of living in a house that's rented at the minute? Are you living in social housing, or do you actually own your own home and that's what you're looking to retrofit? It would be really interesting to hear from everyone who's attending. Okay, so Colleen is an owner occupier of a 1980s home. Sabina's in rented accommodation. Rose is a landlord who has a property. And there's another renter online. Okay, so there's quite a mix, which is really interesting to hear.
There's also someone that's a homeowner. You can put that in the Q&A section. Yeah, and I imagine there is some crossover, isn't there, between sort of what homeowners can do and what renters do. It kind of depends on what their landlords are like. But perhaps do we want to move on to home ownership and look at some of the measures people can take there?
Yeah, so obviously for us, home ownership's a really exciting one because it's the one where you can change everything. You've got the powers in your hands to do exactly what you like, and because it's your property, there's sort of no restrictions on that, unless you live in sort of a conservation area, unless there's planning rules that come into play. But maybe I'll let Charlie talk about the house that he's in at the minute and what the work is he's doing on that.
Okay, so the reason why this is internal wall insulation is because it's a corner plot. So quite nice Accrington stock facing brick on the front. I know this because it blued my drill bits when I tried to drill into it. And the gable walls overhanging the pavement as well as being on the corner. So the council were unprepared to allow external wall insulation. We've been developing an internal wall insulation system for a couple of years now to try and deal with the parlous level of training and skills and indeed product in internal wall insulation. So this is a system we've been working on that is insulated. It's all wood fibre pretty much, except for the shiny bits immediately around the plastic windows that I couldn't persuade the customer. So there is trying to do insulation up against UPVC windows, which upset me greatly. But she's just bought new ones upstairs before she did us to help. So we've designed these so that we can actually take the reveals out later, the liners, so they'll be able to change the windows later and put them where they ought to be. And this will achieve a U value of about 0.3, and then we're doing the floor as well, and with this product of the week for the Prince fans in there is now a Purple Rain. We've been using a paint on air tightness membrane that when you're trying to paint it on above your head rains purple on you. So that's what we've been singing on site all week. But as Nadia said, if you own your own home, you can do a great deal to it. But then there's a sort of process to that of what target you want to get to, which Nadia kind of sort of partially mentioned in how what level what performance target are we aiming at? So I've just been doing a little bit of work with the UK Green Building Council via the Sustainable Housing Action Partnership in the Midlands, and we've ended up on something not far off a standard developed by the Association of Energy Conscious Buildings, the AECB, a few years ago. And so rather than just relying on EPCs, because EPCs, you can get an EPC of a C just by sticking PV on your roof and going to a heat pump. You don't need to do any demand reduction. But demand reduction is critical if we're to end up being able to hit zero carbon, because we can't generate all of our power needs for the energy that's required to heat our homes currently. So that then becomes the ask to the customer is, how far do you want to go? Do you want to make sure that what you're doing to the property, do you have your own finance to deploy? Do you want to make sure that the cost of that finance is less than what you're paying in bills at the moment? Or if you're going out and borrowing, same deal. Do you want to make sure that the loans you're repaying are less than what you're currently paying in your energy bills? So you can still get quite a long way on that. I mean, I've got some slides if anyone does want to see some pictures, but I'll wait for a clamour from the chat if anyone wants pictures. But the long and short of it is, you can actually get a house to zero operational carbon over a year by demand reduction, quite extensive demand reduction work, down to between 25 and 40 kilowatt hours per square metre per annum. Max out the PV on the roof. Be nice to your district network operator so you can have 5 kilowatts or more of PV on the roof because you've got the battery, and go to a heat pump, and you can get the whole thing to work. It's pricey though. This year it's 50 grand on average, which is not for the faint-hearted. We're doing a project at the moment with Procure Plus called Homes as Energy Systems, where we're going to try and prove that with a 50% intervention from the old lovely European Regional Development Fund. We'll let you know how that goes. But our assumption is that the price of retrofit will drop once we've developed a market. So if there's anyone out there who wants to help develop that market by getting their retrofits done now, because they are somebody that maybe can afford it, then you wouldn't just be paying the money just to be upfront. You'd be paying the money to help develop the industry, which is in a very, very poor state. The reason why we set Red up is because there's so many people talking about it, but you go and try and find a supply chain to deliver retrofits at the moment. And so that's why I'm on site on a Saturday.
We've got a question, Liz is asking what PV is.
Photovoltaic, Liz. It's the shiny panels on the roof that generate electricity, as opposed to solar thermal panels, which are often the tubes which generate hot water.
Great, and we do also have a request for seeing the pictures, but I wonder if Nadia, if you wanted to say anything quickly before.
Yeah, so I'll let Charlie sort of load up his pictures. There's a few topics Charlie touched on there. I guess the first one that I wanted to mention was this concept of what we call a fabric first approach. And a fabric first approach means that before you look at generating more energy, so installing the solar, photovoltaic or PV panels, looking at installing heat pumps and things like that, fabric first means you look at how much energy your building is using and try and reduce that energy to start off with at any point, powered by anything. So improving the fabric of your building. And this one's really, really important because as we go over the next few years, as Charlie mentioned, we are going to see issues in trying to meet the energy demands of our buildings. We actually are already seeing those issues come through, especially the past 2 weeks. One of the reasons that the UK has been hit so hard by this hike in energy prices in comparison to other countries in Europe is because we use a lot of gas to heat our homes. And as the prices of wholesale gas have increased, we're seeing those reflections in our bills. So I think prices of wholesale gas have increased by about 4 times, but we're seeing those reflections in our bills going up about a third, which is a huge amount for consumers. When you're looking at countries like Norway, who don't use half as much gas to heat their homes, they're actually faring a lot better than we are. So that's the first point, fabric first approach, and that's what we always look at, and the sort of method of retrofit that we go for. Charlie also talked about sort of energy performance certificates and why I think the whole sort of geeky retrofit industry really have a vengeance for energy performance certificates. And yeah, I have to admit it. And at this point, I don't really think it's a controversial thing to say, but we have to deal with them. We have to deal with them quite a lot because it's the main way that people can actually understand how energy efficient their building is. You know, rating a building from A to G is a really clear way of breaking that down. It's a really easy thing to understand. And energy performance certificates are the thing that people look at when they go to buy a house or when they go to rent a house to think about what their bills are going to be. So it's a really good tool. In itself as a concept, I think it's great. But as Charlie mentioned, the way that energy performance certificates work is it's a bit of a tick box exercise. So you've got gas central heating, and is the boiler efficient? Tick. Yeah, you've got solar panels, tick. So that's not always the best way to look at how efficient a building is, because every building is different, and there's a lot of things that go into thinking about how efficient a building is. You know, one of those things when we look at retrofit is the air tightness of the building, as in how well does it actually hold in heat, how well does it hold in sort of the air when, and how many leaks are there on your heat. So yeah, energy performance certificates, if you're looking at retrofitting a house and you're looking at improving the EPC rating, bear it in mind, but I don't think you should take it as the be all and end all. I think your aim should be to make your home more comfortable and use less energy overall. Going on to financing solutions, actually maybe we should talk about those in a bit, because there are quite a few options for homeowners, I think, Charlie, in comparison to the other types of people. So maybe I'll let you share your pictures first.
I see we've also got a question in the chat, but we'll come to that later as well.
So I was just going to whistle through. Let's move the chat box out of the way. There we go. Who knew that stayed live? So this was the offer we did for West Yorkshire last year. That's what you could get to, and it's almost like we're tag teaming it, because the whole point of it is, as Nadia said, it's got to be fabric first. But our point is, it's not fabric only. And when it comes to paying for it, the space on your roof is as valuable as an open field for PV arrays in terms of cost, up to about 5 megawatts of array. And so let's get those used. The issue, however, being that obviously you've got a linear relationship between your bill savings, but you've got an exponential rise in costs as you chase each kilowatt of heat leaving the building. This is stuff I've been saying for years, and I feel like a bit of a stuck record, but gradually it's getting there. You take the outside of the building and you make it look nicer, but you also make it an awful lot warmer. Where they won't let you, you put wall insulation on the inside, so that's usually the front, but bay windows are not for the faint-hearted. I've been stung 3 times on bay windows now, the one behind me being the current one to get stung by. But then your loft, room and roof is quite a popular thing, and one of the things that's interesting about retrofit is it's not necessarily just about saving heat. It's also about making best use of the space you've got in the building. So we're on our third loft conversion, even though we're retrofit specialists. This one's a kind of partial in that the back room was so small, we suggested insulating at roof level so they could get a little plywood sleeping deck in to get a bit more space in the room. There's the wall insulation system that we've been doing here. And underfloors, again, a wide variety of places, methods, and obviously in Manchester a tad moist. We've been experimenting with recycled glass pumice. Salford's put some sensors under one of our installs recently to see how it goes. Windows and doors, those lovely people over in Home Firth at the Green Building store, they're pricey, not for the faint-hearted in terms of cost, but you can radically improve the prospect of your property, and they're very airtight because they're double sealed and they're triple glazed, and they're made of wood, not plastic. That's a vacuum insulated door in the top right-hand corner. But obviously, what other thing we've been trying is to see if we can put the IWI in first while the windows are in order, just to reduce the time. But if you can't afford them, one of the things you can do is take your sashes apart and take the parting bead and the staff bead and replace those with ones with a little brush seal in them. Take the actual casements, the sash casements themselves, and put double glazed units in them, but you do have to change the sash weights, which are accessible through that little box that's halfway up that picture on the left. For the old rotten Victorian opening casement, secondary glazing on the nice stained glass features, but then you can remake the casements, the side opening casements beneath them, so that you can, and in some cases you can triple glaze those. We have done that. The other thing that Nadia mentioned is that cold bridging and air tightness don't feature in EPC certificate calculation, but actually up to 30% of your property's performance is lurking in there, around the edges of the windows and especially around the eaves, around the edges of the doors. Services, you can do something neater with them, so you don't just have to stick crappy plastic in, but you really must make sure you ventilate. And then we head into some of how you might finance it. So PV on the roof, I'll come back to the numbers on that. Heat pumps, again, they're a bit pricey this week, but one of the interesting things, and this is where Fabric First really plays out, if you do the demand reduction work on your property before you go to a heat pump, you may well not have to, you'll have to confirm this with the engineer, but in our case, this worked, that if you've retrofitted the property, the heat demand is sufficiently low to be able to use the lower temperature available that comes out of a heat pump compared to a gas boiler, that'll still heat the house adequately using the existing pipework and the existing radiators. But obviously you've got to radically reduce the demand first, because a gas boiler chucks water around at about 55 or 65, whereas a heat pump starts to complain at anything over 40. Here's the numbers. Oh no, that slide's died. I'll come back to that one. But the long and short of it is, there's your exponential costs. If you try and service the debt, then if you go high street, then those are some quite nasty sums of money for your 100%. But if we had access to Public Works Loan Board interest rates from before the Tories slapped an extra percent on them, then you could have done that kind of thing. And there are bonds being sold by registered providers in London and Quadrant, that would give you those kinds of interest rates. Because obviously what you're fighting is a linear bill reduction. You're saying, well, I want to half my bills, quarter them, etc. So you have that sweet spot where the cost of your work, the cost of paying the loan back, is going to skip past the amount of money you're saving. If you put the PV and the battery on it, it goes a little bit better, but obviously you've got the extra cost of the PV and the battery. It's only when you get to the volume that you can then make that sweet spot move sufficiently far north to make it all work. I'll come back to some more pictures on that if anyone wants it later, but I thought that was worth just skipping through.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's really nice to see those practical pictures of all of that insulation being installed, because I think one thing that we don't tend to think about when we're thinking about retrofit is actually you really need to fit this in around the work that you're already doing in the house. So if you're putting in a new kitchen and you're taking out all your units, that is the perfect time to take up the floors in the kitchen and do some underfloor insulation if you've got sort of suspended floors. You don't really want to be doing underfloor insulation when you've just, put down a new carpet, or you've just bought all new furniture for your room, and it's going to be a hassle, because it can be something that is it's really taxing and it's really testing to be living in a house where a retrofit is happening. But that's sort of one of the things that you've got to think about. So always try and fit it in when you're doing other work around the house. And I think that's what a retrofit coordinator can help with. So for people living in London, that is sort of one of the services that we offer. A individual who's qualified in this area can be assigned to your project to help you through the whole process, and also help you managing builders and managing contractors that are going to do this install and check that it's being done to a good standard. I thought it would also be just good to talk a little bit about the different kinds of insulation we've got there. So sort of one of the things we've missed, and I'm not sure, looking at the kind of homes we've got a 1960s house, we've got a 1980s house. So when we talk about external and internal wall insulation, we're talking about properties that don't have a cavity wall, so they've got solid walls. It's when you're installing this kind of insulation, one of the things you need to look out for is taking into account that if buildings were built with a solid wall, they were really built to be bringing in moisture and sort of breathing in and out. And when you've got to install your external or internal wall insulation, you really need to think about ventilation at the same time and how you're going to maintain the method that the building was built in all those years ago with the new technologies that you're putting in. If you're not thinking about ventilation at the same time as insulation, that could start causing problems for you, like damp and other issues. And it's something that we've seen quite often with sort of previous schemes that where the government really encouraged people to install sort of cavity wall insulation, and there was a surge of installers who are installing it not very well quite often. So one of the pictures you had on your slides there, Charlie, was a very colourful image of a room and different spots of sort of red and blue and yellow. And that is from something called a thermal imaging survey. And this is one of the services that we do through the Future Fit Homes programme. It's very exciting if you love these things, because it's so engaging. You literally walk around your house and you can see exactly where the problem areas are. You can see exactly where your home is leaking heat from. You can see exactly where, there's the sort of exterior walls meeting the interior walls, and there's some thermal bridging happening, which is making you lose heat. So it's a really clear way to help you focus on actually pinpointing the issue areas of your home. So if you can get a thermal imaging survey, I would really recommend looking into that where you are. So shall we, there's just a question from Rose in the comments. What do you need to do to increase the solar array up? I'm not sure, Rose, what that means, but if you can send the question in again, we'll look at it. EPCs were very much slated in the last session with ideas for something more. It felt like it might be helpful if all the participants today would have a great time if they work together on improving EPCs or something better than an EPC. I mean, Charlie, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I was going to say before that actually when you have an EPC done, part one of the numbers, if you don't just dwell on the letter and you go through your energy performance certificate, and towards the end of it at the back, there is the estimation of space heating demand. And so actually we don't need, so I was going to come back to you on this, that I don't think we need to ditch EPCs. We just need to focus on some of the other numbers that are available from them, and then lobby quite hard for a nearer to full SAP version. So for anyone that that follows these things, I'll just geek out for a second. Energy performance certificates are built on a reduced data version of the standard assessment procedure, which is therefore RDSAP for short. I built a full SAP modeler 8 years ago for modeling retrofits on, when everyone was telling me, oh no, you don't use SAP for that, it's only for new buildings. But actually it works a treat for retrofit and has given me some very accurate retrofits. where we discovered this mismatch between coal bridging and the rest of it. So I think we can simply improve the way that EPCs are calculated, and then just it's a simple matter of just refocusing, maybe even changing the layout slightly, because obviously there's a standard pro forma at the moment that just emphasizes that space heating demand figure right down at the end of it. And actually, I don't know whether it does default to dividing that number by the floor area of the house to give you the annual space heating demand as a per square meter figure, so that you can then compare it more readily. And so I think we're not after, I mean, obviously, as you get nearer to zero, you need more accurate calculation methodologies. So a proper conscientious full SAT model or the passive house planning package, PHPP, become quite useful. But actually, for most of us mere mortals, just a better version of RDSAT would be better. And we're working on some of that with a project called Zero Carbon Rugeley with Engie at the moment to try and see if we can get something out of the water on that. The other thing I did want to mention though, Nadia, is that actually we've done, I think, about 10 underfloor insulation installs now. We've only lifted the floor on 2 of them. We always create create a floor hatch, and then go in underneath. That's why my Purple Rain was so exciting, because we've now found a way of getting an air tightness layer in the right place in the construction without having to dismantle the house. Because there is nothing, I mean, even this internal wall insulation we're doing here is disruptive, but at least the furniture is piled up in the corner. When you come to do underfloor by lifting the floor, it is an absolute nightmare. And so
Yeah.
as long as you've got some scrawny operatives, you can do underfloor insulation. Obviously, quite a lot of builders may well be less scrawny than they used to be, and that can create a problem. Certainly, the one I showed in the pictures, that was one shoulder at a time out of the hatch in the floor, but an enormous space underneath. And this house we're in at the moment, it's built on a slight hill, and so the undercroft is vast. And you could, well, one of our lads is quite diminutive, and he can stand up in it.
Wow, amazing. I mean, it's really great to hear that there are loads of builders and contractors and installers. Well, not loads. There are some that are looking into different ways of doing this work less disruptively. One of our retrofit coordinators' favorite pieces of kit is a robot that goes under the floor and sprays the
Oh,
insulation in for you. And he gets so excited about this robot. So I think, yeah, I think that's wonderful. It's great. But yeah, just on improving EPCs, I think for me, one of the
sorry, just
things,
quickly.
yeah,
There's
go
there's a
ahead.
picture of a grand undercroft for you with the product, the producer of the Purple Rain on it.
Oh gosh, amazing. I've never seen that before in my life.
No,
What an
we
insight.
were quite chuffed. It makes such a difference.
That's brilliant. Yeah. So yeah, on EPCs, as Charlie mentioned, the software that goes into calculating the EPCs, or the program that's run on that software, I think for me, one of the tough things is that it's not up to date as I would like it to be. And it's a tough one because government works quite slowly to update these things, or the relevant government organizations work quite slowly to update these things. Technologies, the price of them, the efficiency of them changes really quickly, which makes it even harder for them to keep up. But I think that's probably one of the main issues for me. And the other one with EPCs is it's great because it's a really low cost way to assess the performance of a building. I mean, EPCs can cost, as low as 60 to 80 pounds for an average home. So it's great that it's low cost and that it's accessible. But on the other side, we've got to balance how accurate they actually are. I've been through countless situations where EPC assessors have written on their form, oh, no access to see if there's this insulation installed here, no access to see if there's this installation installed here. Oh, it's assumed that this exists, it's assumed that that exists. And I think that is one of the problems of them being quite inaccurate, because the EPC assessors only got really an hour or so to go around and do this assessment of a building. So it is hard to get an accurate view of what is installed. Francesca, yeah, do take us back to the questions.
Um, so
Oh,
Well, so I think you might be able to see these as well, actually, if you click on that Q&A bit at the bottom. So
Got it. Great.
yeah.
So anonymous attendee is asking, why aren't you considering wall insulation in houses with cavity walls? Great question.
I am.
Okay, go ahead.
So we've done one installation on a cavity wall house already, because the cavity wall insulation was so badly installed, that it was a national first in my view to have a chilled cutlery drawer, because the air was coming in through his waste pipe next to his kit under his right round from his sink, and then running up inside the cavity and then coming out of another hole round where one of the sockets for his cooker was, and coming out through his cutlery. So he got condensation on his cutlery when he pulled it out the drawer in winter. So we did external wall insulation on top of the cavity wall for him. We took a view that because it wasn't solid wall and therefore wasn't used to moisture transpiration through the bricks itself, we did use an expanded polystyrene product, albeit one with lots of little holes drilled in it to allow some moisture movement. And we are looking at, for the Homes Energy Systems project, we are looking at adding another layer of insulation to already insulated properties, because the problem with the cavity wall is that if you want to get to a U value that will enable you to be a zero carbon house, you're not going to be able to do it with the space you've got in your average cavity. And even in some of the grounder cavities that are 100 mil, you'd need to be blowing aerogel in there, and aerogel is really, really pricey. So a layer on the outside of that doesn't hurt. And also the other problem we've encountered is that quite a lot of people have had a very badly installed spray-in cavity wall insulation, and so actually a layer of EWI on the outside becomes really handy, because you can also then deal with the dreadful thermal performance you get around quite a lot of cavity walls, where builders seem to think a little strip of plastic is enough to avoid a thermal breach where the windows are.
That's really interesting. I haven't heard of actually putting external or internal wall insulation as an extra layer on where you've got a cavity wall. But for those people who are kind of new to this area, with cavity walls, you have that gap to install the insulation between the two layers of walls or the cavity. So that is traditionally where you would put the insulation. I think for us, we really aim to, we want to retrofit as many properties as we can. And when we're looking at a property that already has cavity wall insulation, if it's been done badly, it's going to be causing damp problems like the one you mentioned, Charlie, where you're getting condensation on your cutlery. But it can be causing problems worse than that as well, of course. One of the issues that we've heard about quite often is this is not cavity wall insulation, but loft insulation, spray foam loft insulation that has been installed, and there's no ventilation, and essentially the rafters of the roof start getting damp and start rotting because of the water that's building up there. But yeah, we would say if you've got cavity wall insulation, there's other things that you can look at first before you look at adding on another layer of insulation. And I think that sort of would be our approach to it. But obviously with every building it's different. Every homeowner uses their building in a different way. So there's different solutions, and it really is, you've really got to get advice for your home, not some generic advice, and apply it to your home. There was so the question from Rose, which was about the solar panels earlier. Those of us who have FITS or the feed-in tariff subsidy have a 4 kilowatt array and an appropriate inverter. If we went up to 5 kilowatt or 8 kilowatt, we would need a new inverter. That's a really, really good point. So a lot of people who've had solar installed back when there were subsidies for it through the feed-in tariff have loved how well it's worked, and loved, especially if you installed the solar around sort of 2012 or earlier, have loved the money that has come back off of those solar panels because the subsidies were quite high at the time. So people are looking at adding more panels onto their roof is something that I might look at in the future as well, because I only put sort of 6 panels on my roof. You will need to upgrade your inverter. Your inverter is only going to last, Rose, about 10 years. So you're going to need to change your inverter throughout the lifetime of those solar panels anyway. Maybe it's a good time to look at changing that, or upgrading the inverter and adding those extra panels when the inverter of your current, the life of your current inverter is coming to an end. So, you know, if you installed it 5 years ago, you've probably still got about 5 years left in your current inverter. So maybe leave it until then. I don't think I can see any more questions for now, Francesca.
Yeah.
I would just add an extra bit to that, though, that talking to my PV installer, he reckons that the lifespan of inverters has been steadily rising since 2012, when we were all putting maintenance provisions in, or we actually have to take that out after 10 years. He reckons that the micro inverters will last the full 25-year life of the panels, which are the ones where you have a little inverter per panel. And he reckoned that, in fact, quite a lot of the newer inverters he's putting in, because he's been at it long enough, he's not had to go back and change as many as we were telling him he would have to. So I think it's definitely prudent to make provision for its replacement. But I think the other thing to do, there's 2 things that you would need to do before you upgraded your PV. The first thing would be to check with your district network operator or district service operator, that is, as in Manchester, it's Electricity North West, whether they will allow you to have the extra wattage, because there are different levels of permission. So the one that is taken as red is is basically 15 amps into their grid, and that's about 3.8 kilowatts, which is why all of the PV installs are about 3.8 kilowatts. However, if you've got battery storage, so that you've got control circuitry in there, so that on a very sunny day, you're still not putting any more than 15 amps into the grid, then your DNO should give you permission to extend your PV. The second issue is you may need to just check with your original PV installer whether what the micro generation certification scheme, MCS for short, what the MCS word is on altering a feed-in tariff installation. You might be better off, if you have got space to extend, just putting a new inverter in separate to the one that's subject to the contract on the feed-in tariff, just to make sure.
Dawn has just asked, how do we know when we need to change the inverter?
Don't know. I've not had one go yet.
Yeah, good question. Essentially, when it stops working, or when the efficiency of the inverter has been dramatically reduced. So, if you've got solar panels, you'll see that you've got probably an app with them to see how much they're generating, and over time you can see how much they're generating. If you can clearly see on your app, you know, it's a really sunny day and they're not generating half as much as you would be expecting them to, or they were, you know, 5 years ago, it's probably a good time to look at getting some advice on whether your inverter needs replacing.
And we've got another question here. Is there any concerted effort to change building regulations for conservation areas? So they're giving the example that they would like to put a porch on the front of the house and more solar panels possibly, but are not allowed to change the look of the front of the house.
Yeah, good question. I mean, we've actually got an event coming up on Wednesday, which is looking at retrofit for conservation area homes. And Historic England will be touching on the really detailed areas of planning and for these kinds of homes. And I'm sure they'll have more insight into what is changing. As far as I'm aware, no, they're not planning to change it, as far as I'm aware. And the reason I say that is because building regulations take so many years to change. We've been working on a policy change called the Future Home Standard, which looks to essentially improve the minimum standards for new homes being built and for existing homes. That I worked on that 2-3 years ago, and that's looking at changing the rules for buildings in 2025 and 2030. So you can see how long it takes to come into play. I can see Charlie laughing here. You can see how long it takes to change legislation around planning permission and around building regulations. It's extremely long.
I think we need to separate out the issues there, though, Nadia, because
Yeah,
planning permission is different to building regs. There
yeah,
is no issue with building regs in conservation areas. The issue
planning.
is the planning permission, and conservation area consent is much more discretionary. We don't need to wait X years for the BRE to take lots of money off the government while they extra test every single thing, like the Future Home Standard, which is subject to so much lobbying from house builders and the rest of it.
Mm.
Conservation area consent is an easier thing to change because it can be up to the local planning committee within reason. And so it does depend on the nature of the designation of the conservation area in the first place. So what's really interesting about the Whalley Range Conservation Area in South Manchester is that in fact they didn't put windows into the designation of it as a conservation area, which means that you don't have to put like for like back in when you take the windows out. And so we didn't have any problems removing all of the mullions and transoms, the cross bits and the vertical bits in the window, so that we could improve the thermal performance and get more light into the property. And I've just got planning permission in another conservation area in the knobby bit of Chorlton, where to put external wall insulation, but it's round the back. So I think your point, Rose, is that it's the look of the front of the house. But even on the front of a house, I think there are things that you can still do. So if the aspect of your roof that is going to face the sun is the one that faces the street, then it is more difficult, but it's not impossible. Obviously, I don't know which particular conservation area it is, but that nice Mr. Musk has created some solar tiles. Solar Sentry had some solar tiles back in the early the teenies, if that's what what comes after the noughties. Is it the teenies? Because we're now into the 20s. Anyway, last decade, Solar Sentry were doing some of them. So they don't perform as well, but you can put them on a roof and you not really be able to tell they're there. And so it's very much a question of negotiating with your local planning officer. Quite a lot of the time, they'll charge you for that privilege, depending on which part of the country you're in. But in other cases, you can get a dialogue going and say, right, well, what are you prepared to consent? What do I have to do? And you may well be able to get away with a porch if you can almost hide it, or you build the porch internally, so you take a small piece of the corridor out. But actually, interestingly, we've developed a system that we've done on several houses, which is so easy. If you're geeky like me and you stay in French homes and you notice they have a double rebate on their doors. So, and what we discovered was if you actually just cut an extra rebate in the front door frame and plant a piece of hardwood in the new little square that you create, so the air's got to go around an extra corner to get out of the front door, you can reduce the heat loss out the front door quite dramatically without having to have some awful sticky strips on it, and the planning officer won't have even noticed. Obviously, that won't remove the heat loss every time you open the door, but at least it will keep the heat loss at bay when the door's shut. I also would counsel getting a multi-point lock set on that door whilst you've got a joiner having taken it off to mill that rebate in it, so that you have still a single barrel, still a single key, but it has 3 or even 5 points of locking on it. Because if those are configured properly, then that clamps the door shut when you lock it on the deadlock, and that further reduces the heat loss. Not wildly cheap, but very effective. It also then means that actually you can have if you've got a family full of teenagers, you can avoid lots of lock changes if keys are lost because you just swap out the barrel.
Yeah, so I think those are some really good points, and especially the point of, planning and conservation areas it does come down to your local planning officer, it does come down to your local council. And I don't think that I've heard that any planning officers have allowed normal solar panels on the front of a conservation area home. But like you said, there are solutions. So the solar tiles, there's also a UK company making them at the minute called Seleco tiles. There are sort of panels that are called building integrated panels. So you take your roof off and you put just panels in instead of your roof. I'm not sure how this would sit with planning officers, but quite often the issue that they have is that it's an extra thing that's added on top of the roof that they don't like. So that is something to consider. Again, external wall insulation, Charlie, as far as I'm aware, it's fine where your building already looks, it's, say you've got white render on the front of the building, you wouldn't have an issue putting external wall insulation.
Well, the issue is
It
thickness.
looks the same.
The issue is the thickness. That's the problem.
Okay.
So Kit Knowles, bless him, did manage to get external wall insulation through Manchester Planning Committee in Chiltonville because he used aerogel with phenolic foam so that he only added 40 mil. And because those properties were arts and crafts, the original rough cast render on those was 25 mil thick. So he only added about 15 mil to the front of the house. But Kit operates in a very, very different budget space to most of us mere mortals. His last retrofit was £475,000, which is not for the faint-hearted. I never did find out how much his system cost him, but it nearly worked. There were a couple of original arts and crafts details that he had the renderers try and replicate that wasn't quite as effective as you wanted it to be. But I think my analysis of this is that in most cases, certainly in 19th century building stock and earlier, where you've got an outrigger out the back of a house but a very compact front, you don't lose a great deal of space, and you reduce the disruption to only those rooms on the front of the house if you do internal wall insulation front. Because I'm a bit of a purist when it comes to design. I don't like this bit where we imitate the original detail that was there, because the imitation is usually quite a pale one compared to what was originally there. You find quite a lot of publicly funded wall insulation schemes in some of our northern towns where they've put pretend brick external wall insulation on, and then the colour fades because it's synthetic, so they become a delicate shade of pink over time, and then they've created a little GRP pretend windowsill in black plastic to stick over the front of that, and I just think no, that's awful. And in that slideshow actually there's a picture of a street in Wigan, and there's one house left that obviously went no, and it's lovely, nice little engineering brick detail around the windows, and you can easily internally insulate that, so we can preserve the streetscape and the heritage and not end up with the problem that they ended up with in Preston, where the EWI was done so badly that the water weeded in down the back of it.
Wow, some really intricate details there. It's amazing to hear about all these stories. But yeah, I think the conclusion here is it's down to your local council, it's down to your local planning officer. And I think as organisations and as individuals, we've really got to start putting more pressure on the planning department to speak to the other departments of the council. And actually, yeah, it's a really good point that Rose made. I think it was Rose, as you've got to take into account that we're in a climate emergency. Most local councils have announced, or a large number of local councils have announced, that we're in a climate emergency, and things do need to change for conservation area.
They haven't told their planning officers about that emergency yet, Nadia. I think
They
that's
have
the
not.
problem. I don't think they've told them yet. I've had this exact same argument with the sustainability officer for Salford when this house was refused external wall insulation. Their sustainability officer was somewhat gobsmacked. His language was quite colourful for such a very reasonable chap. He was a bit stunned that there's Salford Council declaring a climate emergency, but then saying, well, you can't have external wall insulation because you can see it from the street. Is it? It's such a bad thing.
Yeah, it's absolutely mad. And I think this is an issue that we're seeing not just in local councils, but in all areas of industry, really. Everyone's sort of working in their own avenues and their own little silos. And if you're in this space, as you know, you're in this energy efficiency industry, or you're in the renewables industry, or you're working in sustainability, we kind of get into our little bubble thinking, you know, climate emergency is obviously the most important thing, and it should be at the forefront of everything. But outside of this space, people just aren't thinking like that. And I think the onus is on us to actually start having those conversations outside of our bubble, and with the departments that are affecting a lot of the work that we do. But yeah, they are the movers and shakers, and they are the ones that are going to be able to allow us to reach a lot more places. But we need to be putting pressure on our local authorities and the different departments within them.
So I just put this picture up because, to be fair to your local planning officers, I don't know about anyone else on this call, but that house just behind the maroon car is easily the prettier one of those. And if I insulated it internally, I could make sure that I didn't end up with the enormous coal bridge that's running along the top of that entire street, where that little dental detail, the little brick detail across the top there, they've left it, which means they've got a nice coal bridge there. And that means that that's also where the roof comes down onto the wall. So you've got a much thinner point there. Your point that you raised earlier, I was going to come back to on the loft insulation, that one of the issues is that if you've got old asphalt sarking felt in your loft, and then you have more loft roll put in, then you end up with a bit where the loft roll is in contact with the sarking felt in most Mancunian homes, because the ceiling joist is the thing that holds the roof together. So it runs at the same level that the ceiling rafters come onto the wall. And that means you've got a very thin spot where you can get a lot of condensation. It soaks into the loft roll and then works its way down to the ceiling joists or the rafters and rots either of them, or just drips annoyingly through the loft. But the point with this, therefore, is that, to be fair to the planners, we ought to be working with them to look for better solutions, because those two to the right, you can always, the one that's just disappearing out of shot on the far right, you can see that it's already faded from the original brick colour it went on at. But even the original brick colour it went on at isn't even close to the brick original. So there is this opportunity to regenerate our neighbourhoods with what we do, but this bit where we have to imitate it all should stop, and we should then put some proper solutions in where they're needed.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to see how how it actually looks practically. Um, there's definitely a lot of work to be done in this space in terms of um, yeah, conservation areas. I'm just wondering, Charlie, if and Francesca, if we should talk about the, I guess, less technical aspects now, because a big part of this is how people pay for this and how they finance it.
Yeah, it'd be interesting, to see the sort of different levels people could sort of make changes at, and then also, if people do want to plan big but don't necessarily have the whatever that figure was that you said earlier, Charlie.
Well, so the way we do it is that we do a full SAP model of someone's house, and then we come up with a plan, so that we show them how much it's going to cost over time, and we let them come to their own view, and we offer them all the choices. So I could share some numbers with you if you want, but maybe not. Maybe I've done enough sharing for now. And so you say, right, well, so that's the first question you ask the customer is, are you having difficulty paying your bills now? Yes, no. What would you like those bills to reduce to so that you can afford them? That's your first point of call. Have you got access to any more money? Or do you have any headroom in your mortgage? So people that have borrowed within the last 10 years probably haven't got any headroom in their mortgages. But people that borrowed longer ago than that may well have some space into which they can they can either remortgage or add an extra loan. And certainly there's
to say that you are being asked to share the numbers.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'll share them then. Sorry, missed that. I'm just acutely aware that I'm baffling people with large quantities of stuff. So here is some numbers. So this is the little business plan that we do for people's homes, where you're looking at. So this is based around all of the numbers that come in from a home. And so we basically work out the measures, and we tick all those measures that people might want to have in their home, and there we go, and then we just let them. And then that comes to a bigger picture, which is what the total cost is going to be. So that one came out at 36,000, and that one was going to give us a house. that was, where's the numbers? Oh, it's gone. There we go. That was going to get us down to 8.5 kilowatt hours per square meter. So that's a pretty nifty performer, that one. That's basically a passive house. Interestingly, though, the EPC is still only 97, so it's interesting that you can get to that. But what I wanted to, all I was saying was that there is that we can do. I think everyone deserves, really, actually, a little business plan for their home that says, right, you've got all of this maintenance that you've got to do. You've got your bills. There's your carbon savings. So there's 6 tons of carbon saved, which is more than you were actually using, because actually you're putting energy back into the grid at peak times. So you're going to be displacing combined cycle gas turbines. So it becomes, and then you can see that you dip in and out of the red. So in this house, it does actually, at the end of the period, you do actually end up better off. However, for the first 3 years, while we get enough volume up to get the energy storage aggregation together to drive the incomes from it, it's actually quite difficult. So those 3 years where it doesn't pay for itself. And then, as Nadia pointed out, you do need to build in the maintenance, so you'll dip back into the red at those points there. And so that's the service we offer. The problem we've got with it is that we didn't get some funding to make it all nice and coded. It's still just a big spreadsheet that's so easy to break. And so we don't get to do many of them because they take up too much time. But the point is that you've got a whole load of numbers that you can assist that you can use to assist it. You've got the savings from your gas bill, the savings from your electricity bill, the income from the PV if you've got it, the bill savings reductions from demand shifting. So if you've got a battery as well, so you basically, people in the trade call it a revenue stack. And you stack up all those numbers, and then you can say, right, but it's going to cost me this much per year to pay for all of that lot. Can I afford it or not? Then we start to look for the other forms of subsidy. So the model I worked out for West Yorkshire, which is less useful for the whole, for an individual householder, but let's get collective about this. This is the time for collective action. The thing we did for West Yorkshire was we said, well, why don't we actually, and the Fabric First devotees will come at me for this, but basically, if we do the battery storage rollout first, then we can generate some income from that if we do it in a way that is more collective. We proposed the idea of a personal retrofit loan fund, a bit like the way that Portuguese housing cooperatives used to fund entry into them, where you started saving, very much like building societies in the 19th century here, where you put in some money into a fund and then eventually you got to have a house. And we were thinking, well, is there a version where you join in a PV and battery scheme that is accelerated ahead of the number of retrofits you're doing, so that it generates some income to run the scheme with, and then the numbers from that rack up against your house, and then you have a retrofit later, so that we can keep the costs at bay. So I think I think the other thing as well is that whilst I would love there to be some people that are good to go now on a retrofit, I do completely understand. People said, whoa, we've got a chicken and egg problem. If everyone says, do you know what, I'll wait for the price to drop, but in order for the price to drop, we need the market to develop, then the market never develops and the price drops. So we're stuck in this circle, because I think what has been proven is sitting waiting for Boris is not an advisable action. And frankly, it wasn't even that good waiting for DEC, because such has been the demise of the public sector in this country, the way it's been hollowed out and underfunded for decades, is that even DEC couldn't quite pull it off, because the Green Deal, whilst it was a nice thought, was so badly executed on so many levels. Any of us in the know knew that was going to be a slow motion car crash, and it sure was. But I'm a big fan of us just getting on and doing it ourselves. It's how the cooperative movement started 200 years ago. I think we can do it again now. We just pool our resources. So I think there is a model. I think we need some public sector help on the borrowing. Manchester, unfortunately, has lunched its prudential borrowing ability on its own house, because it's borrowed £330 million to retrofit its own house, that's a big retrofit. Admittedly, it's a big place and it's grade 1 listed and it is a nice building, but if you've got a local authority that has access to some borrowing capacity, and then they can on-lend that money, but it's underwritten by the local authority, that would make it cheap enough. That was back to that graph I showed earlier, so that you would be able to borrow more money to make more carbon savings, to reduce your bills further without ending up worse off. So that was a very long answer to how we pay for this. I think because there's two sides to this. The one is how does the individual householder pay for it, but then the other side of it is how do we at the kind of delivery end capitalize a lending institution. I think we need our own. I mean, we don't have a state that is as interventionist as the German one, but the Germans had a bank 20 years ago that was specifically for funding low carbon activity, and it lent at outrageously low rates for really long periods of time to enable people to do it. Exactly the same principle as council housing was funded in the 60s in this country. Um, but we need something a bit something like that would be lovely, because if we can get those interest rates low enough, and then the other thing you then do is if you've got a bit of surplus income from your storage revenues, and you can lend slightly more expensively than the source of your capital, so that you can generate enough, a teeny tiny surplus to run the lending side of it, so you don't have to charge people for that. And then if you can then build a vehicle that runs at a deficit for the first 5 or 6 years, because you don't want to sting those early adopters for the full 50k price tag. What you want to do is get them to pay something that they can afford, and then the money owing from that gets repaid out of the scheme as it grows. So what you end up with, I'm just going to share a very brief graph on this one, because I think it'll make a lot more sense, and people there seems to be appetite for graphs, and I do like appetite for a graph. So come on, there we go, and then we go back to Zoom, and we go. Sorry about this. It does. One day there will be a nice seamless way of doing this, but it doesn't seem to be this week, because even though I lined up the slideshow there, it still didn't do it. Right. So there you have. If you borrowed money for your retrofit this year, that's how much it would cost you per year to repay it for a full zero carbon retrofit. Here is all of the bits that would offset against the cost of that loan. So as you can see, if we could get the industry developed quickly enough, then you can actually break even in about 7 or 8 years' time. But that requires an industry to develop. So obviously anyone going this year, they're going to be paying, £1,300 more per year on average. This is the very important thing. This is the average home. What we found, I did the modelling for Carbon Corp's Green Deal Go Early project back in 2014. Was that, and the retrofit design, in fact, was that actually people living in those basket case houses with £2,500 gas bills, they won't be any worse off. We can still make them better off. So these are all based on the national average bills. But as you can see, it's a bit of a basket case for the next few years. However, if we don't do thousands in those opening years, we do just enough to get the industry developed and up to speed, then the amount of money that you're exposed to in terms of debt is actually controllable. In the overall public policy terms, being a few £1 million adrift when you're funding a multi-billion-pound programme across the whole of Greater Manchester is not all West Yorkshire. It's not a big deal. And you can get rid of that if you do your PV and storage deployment up front. Then you can actually easily eclipse that, so that you actually remove that deficit altogether if you do it on an accelerated rollout. The other thing is, for those of you that are going to go and tune into the Tyndall gig on Monday at the Screen Summit, we're so far away from our carbon emissions reduction trajectory. It's absolutely bloody terrifying. The only reason why Tyndall were able to say 2038 would work as a number was because we were supposed to be making a 15% per year reduction in our emissions starting the year they wrote the report, which was 2017. The emissions have gone up, so that budget's way out adrift. However, if we can do this accelerated PV and storage, it does actually save quite a lot of carbon now, and then as the grid heads towards zero, the benefits then are less there for carbon. But by then we'll have retrofitted all the housing stock. So as you can see, that red line of emissions reductions in our housing comes an awful lot closer to what Tyndall told us to do. Oh, and you can eradicate fuel poverty in the first 10 years.
That's really, I'm glad that you finished on the fuel poverty slide there. I mean, it's a really good overview of as a country what direction we're headed in and how much more we need to do. And I think there's definitely merit in looking at schemes where people are retrofitting together and bringing down costs when they're doing that as a group. And as you mentioned, Charlie, these sort of shared ownership or shared generation schemes as well, where you're investing together and building up those revenue streams. But I just want to bring it really, really back to basics. And I wanted to ask everyone in the chat, can you guys tell us a little bit about, if you're looking at retrofitting, have you got a budget in mind yet? And if you have got a budget in mind, how much is that budget, if you're comfortable sharing? And it would be great to know what regions everyone is in as well, because prices for these kind of things do differ across different regions in the UK. But so just to start off with homeowners, you were talking about, Charlie, essentially, if you've got some stretch room, some wriggle room in your mortgage, a remortgage is a good option. And that's probably the most common option that people are using to do sizable retrofit projects. That's obviously very easy to go and organize. You just speak to the bank that you've got your mortgage from and see what you would be able to borrow. Very commonly done. We do it for loft conversions, we do it for extensions, and it's going to be the main thing that people use for retrofit as well. Another option, if you own your house outright, so you know, often we find that this is a good one for perhaps pensioners that have managed to pay off their mortgage, and sort of maybe they don't have the cash saved up, but they do own their house. Is something called equity release. Equity release is often it's offered by sort of social impact organisations. So I think the London, the main equity release people in London are called London Rebuilding Society. And again, we are looking at doing a webinar on all of this stuff as well through Future Fit Home. So if you're interested, go ahead and check out our website, and if you sign up to the mailing list, we'll send you all of these events that we have coming up. But equity release essentially allows a bank or an organisation to take a stake in your property, and then when you either sell the property or someone passes away and that property is sort of going through probate, the organisation that's lending the amount of money will take a percentage of the property, and will take a percentage of the money when that property is sold afterwards. So equity release is a really interesting one for people that own their homes outright. You've also obviously got the stuff about looking at normal kinds of loans. That's probably not as feasible because the rates are higher, but the kinds of personal loans that you can secure, and it's a smaller amount of money you can access as well. But if you're looking at installing solar panels, this is definitely a feasible option to look at a personal loan or something of similar cost. Apart from that, I think that kind of covers it, Charlie, for the options for homeowners. I did want to go into looking at funding retrofit for social housing and for people on low incomes, if that's all right as well. But if you've got anything to add on homeowners financing options, that would be.
So they were that was the scale of lending options that we proposed last year in West Yorkshire. That if you've got pots of cash and you want agency, and you want your money to do something useful, then actually let's create a retrofit bond. And I believe there is something being thought about. A company called Abundance has created some bonds in other parts of the country, and they're talking to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. So that'd be something where if you can fund your own retrofit, but you might want to help other people fund theirs and still get a return on it, then there's an option. Obviously, if you can, we want to be able to create loans. One of the reasons about the loans is not just that you can have cheaper loans. It's also so that one of the problems other retrofit delivery organisations in other parts of the country have had is where they're competing. Retrofit Works is competing with its own members in the southeast and in Oxfordshire, where they want to charge an overhead on the retrofits because they've got to look after it, pay for the coordinator, the retrofit coordinator, and all the rest of it, and then their members do the work. But what's happening is some their members are just going and get work anyway. So if you had access to if we could create, and the reason why I say, or those of you on the call, that these aren't things that happen yet. However, you can lobby your local councillors, you can lobby anyone you talk to. These are the things we need. We need a finance vehicle. We need regional ones so they're accountable to the communities they serve, rather than just an enormous, great big thing feeding off the City of London and paying for people's Moe Chandon habits. But that would enable you to then enforce quality retrofit as a condition of having access to the loan. Those loans should constitute quite a significant part of your lending portfolio, which would then enable you to grant unsecured loans, still at the same interest rates, but if you've got enough asset cover across the whole of your lending portfolio, you should be able to do some unsecured loans on those people that don't have any headroom in their mortgages to secure it. And then you've got people that can't even afford that. Those people in fuel poverty, but they own their homes, so they're asset rich, cash poor, as the jargon sometimes goes on. Where you could maybe give them loans at the cost of their finance, and then, as Nadia implied, there is this opportunity for equity. I'm always very careful when talking about equity lending, because certain high street banks have made an enormous amount of money out of some deeply unethical, horrible products. I'll let Ethical Consumer talk about the opportunities for equity lending and how you can shaft your punters with that one. So we need to make sure it's a different model. And I know that Rochdale Council was providing equity lending back in the days of housing market renewal, and they ended up having to put a ceiling on it because HMR was working so well that the values were rising, and they were ending up with outrageous APR rates because they were saying, well, we don't want a share of the property until you sell it, but we lent you 10% of the value. Can we have 10% back? And they were ending up getting quite a lot of money back, so they put a cap on that. But equity lending is definitely a thing, and I think if you've got a broad portfolio, then you can. That's how I think we can get rid of fuel poverty. Is that we make sure that we use those that are wealthy, not directly, not asking them to directly subsidise, but by building a mixed loan book. Now, obviously, for those of you with a knowledge of how the 2008 crash happened, this is a subprime potential nightmare if somebody went on and sold that loan book and concealed some of the basket cases in it. But I think that now we've learnt that lesson and we could make this work. I think the other point with this about having a finance vehicle is that you could marry that up with a maintenance service. One of the things that's happened in the rush for people to own their own homes is an awful lot of people haven't realised that when they're paying a landlord for their rent, their landlord looks after the property. They then take it off them and then go, oh, bugger, I need to replace the roof, and they haven't got any money saved. I think if you're lending money to a retrofit, you can then, because you want to make sure that the asset you've lent into retains its value, it is in the lending institution's interests to assist that customer, not just punish them, assist them in looking after their property. And I think that might be one of the ways of getting to some of the micro, small private landlords as well. Some of those that have inherited Granny's house when she died and then they rent it out to make a bit of cash, but have no idea how to look after it. We could help them. And therefore, alongside that, it would not be against the mission, the financial interests of that body to then have a progressive letting agency standing alongside that to help make it work. So there's all sorts of things we can do, but I think a lot of the individual action is limited. It's only when we start to stand up together and say, right, here's some shit that needs to happen, let's make it happen.
Yeah, and we would absolutely love for anyone that's part of any organisations in the audience or anyone that's interested in working this space to get in touch with us and join us in this sort of mission to get more on the table for financing retrofit. Yeah, so just in terms of the other types of individuals apart from homeowners, there are also solutions for people that are on low income and especially people who are living in fuel poverty. So a lot of the work that we do at CELSI, and sort of one of the main reasons we were set up back in 2007, back 7 years ago, was because a group of local residents from Greenwich and Lewisham in southeast London came together, and they were really both upset about climate change and had an understanding of how fast we needed to move to address this problem, but also aware that a lot of people were being left behind in this journey to go green. And Southeast London actually has one of the highest levels of fuel poverty across Europe. And we are seeing extremely high numbers of winter deaths. We're seeing extremely high numbers of deaths of people during the summer from overheating, and we've seen a lot more of that. And we've seen a lot more people fall into fuel poverty over lockdown as well, and during COVID-19. So just to contextualize how big the issue is, 2 years ago, before lockdown, we were employing 3 people to give advice on energy bills and on energy issues for people in fuel poverty, and they weren't employed full time. Fast forward 2 years later, we're working out of a much bigger office. We've employed about 11 people to support with this service, and most of those people are full time. So you can see how quickly the need to support people in fuel poverty has jumped over the past 2 years. And with our summers getting hotter and our winters getting colder, this problem is only going to get a lot worse. So in terms of what support is out there for people on low income and people in fuel poverty, there are a few funding schemes through the government that can support retrofit. One of the main schemes that we use is called the Energy Companies Obligation, or the ECO scheme. Now, this is basically money that's been taken from naughty energy companies that have overcharged people, and they're obligated to put some grant funding into retrofit. So we can actually support people that usually they have to meet certain eligibility criteria, like be in receipt of certain benefits, or have a certain income threshold that they have to meet. But in London, we've managed to get our local authorities to secure a bit of a wider net to sort of catch these people and widen the eligibility criteria, and that's called essentially our local council have signed up to something called Eco Flex criteria, and I think, Charlie, in Manchester the council haven't signed up to that. So I've been talking to Carbon Co-op about encouraging them to do this, but I think all councils should really sign up to this criteria. But that allows for us to refer people who need insulation, who need who don't have a working boiler and things like that, or have a very old, very inefficient boiler or electric heating, to get insulation measures installed. Now you would have to go through some sort of energy advice service to access this funding and to be signed up to the service. But it means that homeowners it means that the individuals don't have to contribute towards any of this at all. So you don't need to put any of your own cash in. This is funded work. I'm not saying it's easy to access. I'm not saying it's the best support in the world, but it is out there. So that's eco funding. There's also lots of other little schemes like local authority LAD funding, local authority delivery funding, which works in a similar way, tries to reach people who are either in social housing or are living in fuel poverty in their own homes or privately rented homes. So if you are in one of those situations where actually you haven't got the money to upgrade your homes, and perhaps it's something that's tough to talk about, but you haven't got the money to cover the cost of your energy bills, there are organisations that can help. So do have a search and find out who your local energy advice service is. Apart from that, I think that kind of covers the finance side of it, unless you've got something to add, Charlie, on this. I think that's it from my end. I think you're on mute.
I want to come to Colette's point at some point, because she's asked a question about that's right down my street and a bit techie. But my understanding with ECO, maybe I missed a trick here, was that ECO, the energy company obligation, was for all electricity suppliers over a certain number of customers they had to pay. because I remember there being quite a furore, well, from the energy company concerned, that Ecotricity, despite being entirely green electricity, would then require to contribute to the energy company obligation. I like the idea of it being a penalty for naughty companies, though. I much prefer that one. If that's what they've moved it to, then that would be an outbreak of common sense in the state that I've not seen for a while. But the problem with accessing eco funding now is that you've got to be a pensioner or in receipt of certain benefits. It's the same as the local authority delivery scheme that you referred to. LAD 3 is the one they've just tendered for, and I think they're probably going to get it. But it's only for the poor. It's only for the poor. No one else can apply, and it's a very sort of binary version of the poor. And this is why I find it slightly challenging. Is that it doesn't actually help those people who are just in the what they call it. It was given a name by some politician. They're just about managing middle or something. There is a spectrum of ability to pay, from the wildly able to pay down to the not a snowball's chance in hell. And the idea that there is just this binary is slightly upsetting. But the other problem with it is that the sums of money are very small. Now, I take your point. If you can get it, do it. But I think the thing that I would like to counsel people think about is to put a plan together for the whole house, so that you don't have any you don't have any work that you have to do again. Our project manager in West Yorkshire referred to them as no regrets measures. So what you don't want to do, for example, is if you've got an aspiration to get your house to an energy consumption of 50 kilowatt hours per square metre per year, which is, in EPC land, probably somewhere around a C or a B, depending on what other things you do with it, then actually, but you can only afford to do this much insulation, then make sure that that bit of insulation can either be added to, or you do one element of the house properly. So we tend, as you saw in the slideshow earlier, we aim at a number that is affordable in a Victorian house out of your existing bills, on low cost finance. But underfloor insulation is not stupid money. And loft top up similarly, but most importantly, loft top up done properly. And this is one of the problems with eco, is that it doesn't pay by performance, it pays by numbers of lofts, numbers of square meters of EWI, which is one of the reasons why it has so many problems. Is that you're not actually, this is one of the things that worries me on the financing, is that if I promise somebody that they do a certain number of measures to their property and it's going to reduce the bills by so much, but they then use a traditional eco delivery operative who then does it, where they two blokes that are paid a tenner each to do an entire loft insulation, dive in, throw loft roll into the house and then leg it so that they can actually make some money on the day, and then leave a whole load of bits around the edge that don't perform. But I've talked that customer into having that work done, but they don't then make the savings, which is a terrible place to be, especially if that was, if I'd done my smooth talking bar steward bit and had got them to a point where they were going for it and they were going to the last penny that they could afford. And so I think we do still need to make sure that the industry is delivering properly. And so I'm glad that you're funding retrofit coordinators. And it'd be interesting to see some method statements on how you can improve what the standard eco measures are, but make sure they're done properly, maybe. But I definitely think that as we're nearing towards the end of this, and I've got 20% battery life left, the thing that I'm most keen on is that people have a plan. So Colette and her windows, for example, yes, if you want to get your windows and doors done now because they're goosed, brilliant. But have a look, get a quote from Green Building Store. Both Red and Carbon Cult can get you the same discount. It's not a huge discount, but at least it's every little counts. It may be too much, and you may actually still end up thinking about plastic. And if they are installed properly, and so we basically reinstalled the windows in this house in two cases, and then done all of the draft sealing and air tightness work around and cold bridging work around them that should have been done by the installer. If you make sure that the install is done properly, then you don't need to move them later. You just make sure that you put them in a location which will suit when you come to do wall insulation later. So if you go to retrofit.support, it's a bit geeky, it's a bit techy, their construction details, but retrofit.support is used, I know, by several retrofit coordinator training schemes to train retrofit coordinators on what to look at. And if you email support@retrofit.support or something, then you'll get through to me anyway. Um, we've got 1,400 unique users on that now, so it works. But on that, you'll see that when you're doing, that the issue is how to make sure that your installation runs from the window into the rest of where it's doing the job, so you haven't got a gap in between. So if you're going to replace your windows on a wall, you're thinking of external wall insulation, move the windows as far out towards where the insulation is going to be as you can manage before it starts to look silly. Or even as I advised a customer, I pretend not even a customer, actually just somebody that rang me up, advised that actually maybe even go for that Victorian detail where the windows are actually outside the masonry, but they've got a little subframe around them that you can then wrap the insulation around later. Or if you're doing it internally, then make sure that have a think about what space you're going to need from the window to where the internal wall insulation is, so you don't get a little condensation trap in between where the wall insulation stops and the window starts, because that is a prime cold bridge, especially on our stone windowsills, and where you can then end up with a little mildewy strip around the outside of your house. So no, I wouldn't dream of you moving the windows when you came to the insulation. You just make sure that you position in the right place first. I realise that you're now going to go, well, how am I supposed to know that? And I suppose that's the point where I volunteered to talk to you. Charlie@red.coop if you need to badger me
Yeah,
for advice.
I think that's really a really useful way to move this on, Charlie. And I think just to sort of finish off that finance topic, it's a tough one, but I think people have to remember when if you're able to pay for this stuff, and don't get too caught up in payback and how it's all going to work, because at the end of the day, if you're looking at putting in a new kitchen, you're not thinking, oh, how is this kitchen going to how am I going to get the payback for this kitchen over time? No, you just put in a new kitchen because you want to put a new kitchen in. And I think to some extent we've got to think about retrofit that way as well. Everyone that's here is here because they're interested in making their homes greener and is interested in tackling climate change. And yeah, we've got to work hard to sort that out. But Charlie, just on your point of where people can get support, obviously, Charlie, you cover all Manchester areas. For Future Fit Homes, you can come and have a half-hour free phone call with us, or video call with us if you like, if you're based in London. I'm sure there are other groups working in other areas outside of Manchester and London. I'm aware that Brighton is covered by Brighton and Hove Energy Services Co-op. There's
Shaving coal.
there's Birmingham Energy Cooperative who have started to do retrofit in Birmingham as well, and then there's lots and lots of community energy groups in Devon that are looking at retrofit. So yeah, do have a search and find out who your local community energy or your local energy co-op is if you're interested in getting some one-to-one support with this. But Charlie, one last point before we finish, and I think this is a topic that we should only spend 15 minutes max talking about. Supply chain. What are we going to do?
So I've just started. Yes, it's absolutely catastrophic. So there's so many people talking about retrofit, and I was talking to Russell Smith of Retrofit Works the other day, and he was saying that he's got local authorities all over the country saying, "Well, yes, just get on with it, just do the retrofits." And he's going, "Who's going to do them?" So our first problem is that we subcontracted the training of high quality operatives to the governments of Eastern Europe for the last 30 years, and now we've made them unwelcome and sent them off home. 200,000 of them have obediently left. We're finding that we are very short of skilled construction professionals, and certainly prepared to work as hard as retrofit is. Retrofit is flipping hard work. And so we've got a problem in terms of a number of workforce. Our existing training infrastructure is frankly not fit for purpose. And I say this publicly as well as on things like this, and I'm prepared to duke it out with anyone that says they've got a training scheme that is fit for purpose, because they will be rare as rocking horse droppings. And so we've ended up training people on the job. We've recently started teaming up with a local company called B4 Box, who train, well, they started off training ex-offenders, but they also train the long-term unemployed and care leavers as well. And at least they've got some core funding to deliver some basic skills. And then we're trying to get up to a position where we can then put them on site and train them. We did a little project last year with out of work theatre workers, and actually two of them have stayed with us. One of them's actually really good. He was a set builder at the Lowry Theatre until they made him redundant just at the start of the pandemic. And so we've been training people on the job, but that is micro. You know, I'm doing a retrofit a year if I'm lucky, and we've got 25 million of the flipping things to do, and nobody wants 25 million Charlie Bakers. That would just be a terrible idea. There will be people that know me rolling their eyes at the mere thought, running, probably trying to get out of the country. So we've got to have a root and branch overhaul of training. But I think the key problem as well, though, is for decades now, construction has been a career of last resort for too many careers officers. If you were too thick to get into the police, the army, or not fit enough for the fire service, you ended up being told to go to college and learn to be a brickie. I meet quite a lot of really skilled tradespeople, but they are all my age, or a bit younger. I have to reluctantly point out, but there's very few young people ending up going through that who are going to be able to handle a retrofit, because it is complicated, because you don't know what you're going to find out until you find it out. So the upper level of this wall behind me, and when we took the plaster off to put the wall insulation on, all of the bricks fell out. And so I then had to redesign the upper floor of this. So this house now has a timber frame in a bay window. Your average MVQ3 joiner is not going to be able to do that. So that's our first problem, is that we need about 700,000 people alongside all the other things we need. I think the material supply chain is less of a problem. I mean, yes, it is a problem this week, but I'm hoping that is merely a demand blip. I mean, yes, because the plywood that's on the front of those battens behind me is actually marine ply at £50 a board, because the shipment of ordinary structural ply they'd had in that week was actually a fiver more expensive, when normally it should be 30 quid cheaper. So we've definitely got a material crisis. But, and here again is a long game, but just to add some numbers onto this, there are 1 million ash trees due to be felled across Greater Manchester alone in the next 10 years. And at the moment, they're just going for firewood. Ash is a beautiful timber. We could use that to build the subframes for external wall insulation, or the stud work. We could have exposed stud work on internal wall insulation. We could do timber panelling. If we could get skill joins back in it, imagine internal wall insulation, but with framed timber panelling like they used to do in the last century, beginning of the last century, and the one before that. That would actually be a practical way of doing a retrofit, because there's 4 million tons of CO2 that is going to be emitted on top of everything else from those ash trees. So we could start to sort supply chain out that way. But then I think the other thing is, there are too few designers frightened of making their own construction details. There are too few companies innovating, because there isn't that relationship with the designers to make it happen. And so there's too little innovation in retrofit, despite the fact that it's a very young industry with some horrific inefficiencies in it that we really need to sort out. Sorry, you asked.
No, it's great, and I think I completely agree with you. But I think for me, and for what we've seen from our retrofit coordinators, and also from working quite closely with Retrofit Works Cooperative, the part of the problem is how the Green Homes grant was administered.
Doesn't help.
Yeah, and the legislation around what level you have to be qualified to actually be able to do retrofit works. And what I'm talking about here is the sort of PAS 2030 and PAS 2035 levels of qualification. I can see you laughing.
On neither of them.
Okay, so I can see you laughing, and it will be interesting to know why you haven't gone for that, because you've obviously got the knowledge that you need to. But from what we're seeing with our retrofit coordinators, and what we've heard from Retrofit Works with their builders, is this level of qualification is extremely hard to get, and once you get it, it is a lot of admin work around retrofit. And I think it's really important that we basically to tackle all this admin work that goes into PAS 2030 and PAS 2035 around retrofit, we either really need to restructure the scheme, but it's come out so recently that it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be restructured very quickly anytime soon. But I think we need, in retrofit, a bit of a digital revolution, similar to what we've seen in the banking industry. And I think that's what will sort of help ease the load for a lot of builders, because a lot of builders aren't bothering to get qualified in these things and aren't interested to do retrofit work because, like you mentioned, Charlie, it's complicated, it's tough, and frankly they're getting a lot of other work that is easier and more lucrative for them to do. Yeah. So, you know, building your, you know, average loft conversion, doing an extension, much easier to do than retrofit, much more lucrative than retrofit. So we need to look at how we can tackle that problem, for me.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the reason I haven't got, I mean, I did get Core to the Retrofit Academy to put me on their experienced professionals training scheme for PAS 2035, but I still had to listen to all of the interminable videos and do all of the things. And Peter Rickaby, the author of PAS 2035, assured me 3 years ago, when I said to Peter, I said, mate, you're about to make it not possible for me to do what I've been doing for 10 years. What's that about? He said, oh, you'll be fine because you're an industry leader. We'll sort that out. So I'm trying to hold Peter to his promise that he's going to sort that out and that there will be some kind of prior experience option that enables somebody at my level of experience to be able to say, yes, you obviously know how to do a risk analysis because I do them every day. I could talk you through about 10 of them in the wall behind me. On PAS 2030, which is so for those of you listening to this wondering what on earth me and Nadia are on about, the publicly available specification number 2035 is the one that governs having a retrofit coordinator to keep an eye on the retrofit, having people that know enough to be able to do a retrofit assessment, and have people that are able to do a retrofit design. Under the terms of that, normally it's becoming the case that if it's publicly funded, you are required to comply with PAS 2035, but most of the skilled retrofitters in this country are not trying to do that because, as you say, it's too difficult to get to. PAS 2030 is only marginally worth more than the paper it's written on, frankly, because again, they've tried to create, and this is the installers version. So 2035 is the design and management side. PAS 2030 is the installer standard, and it's quite sensible, you know, that if you're doing internal wall insulation, one of you has to have a qualification in it, and the other three have to be on a industry recognized pathway. But then there is the problem: if you go and try and find an industry recognized, whatever that means, because what does that mean? It's not defined. You end up with people offering NVQ training in retrofit measures. And I've had a look at a couple of the course booklets for these, and there are 10 modules, but only one of them is in the actual retrofit measure because the colleges offering them actually don't have anyone able to do proper retrofit training. So all they're doing is bending their standard construction training. So you're spending an entire module learning how to sign your own name, another module learning how to not fall off a ladder, another module learning how to be polite to customers, another module learning how to work with others. It really is spoon feeding tick box stuff, which is fine for a sector of our working population. Don't get me wrong, it is definitely needed for those people for whom education has not been their bag and they are going to go into construction. You need to get them to a point where they can go off and earn a living. But it's not going to train us in how to do retrofit. And so you've got a lot of the best retrofit companies are just going nowhere near public funding because it carries with it this requirement. And then, as you say, the admin. So we looked at getting PAS 2030 registration for some of our measures. And then it says you've got to have a quality management system. And you think, well, what on earth's a quality management system? And then you go to ISO 9000, you think, well, why on earth do I want to waste half of my life doing triplicate versions of my paperwork? And my worry is that actually an ethical operator shouldn't need to have all of that policing. Construction has its own tax regime, where if I'm a subcontract carpet fitter, then you can pay me all of my money when I finish the job. But if I'm a brickie or a joiner, and I finish a piece of work, you have to take between 25 and 50% of what I'm owed off me and give it to the taxman. Because the assumption is that if I'm a builder, I'm a dickhead. And it really is just absurd and offensive and wrong and counterproductive. And it is not going to deliver us what we need delivering if they continue to treat construction as basically a bunch of incompetent crooks. And that's the problem underlying. And unfortunately, the reason why PAS 2035 came about was the Each Home Counts review at the demise of the Green Deal to find out how it had gone that wrong. But what it failed, and I think I can say this in an ethical consumer or Gust do, what they failed to address was the extremes of unregulated capitalism when given a whole new area of industry to regard as a profit centre. So it went and blamed all the operatives when in fact the problem was that you had companies using it as a profit centre because they had caught a cold on a construction job and they were charging 50% margins. I know this, I've got the paperwork for a certain major construction company, now absorbed by another major construction company, that was doubling the price it was getting off its subbies that it was passing on to the customer. And then, of course, you've got subbies being lent on to deliver the job really, really quickly because the boss is forcing them to. And yet it's the subbies' fault, not the boss's fault when it comes to regulation. It's not the right end of the problem. Rant over, sorry.
So yesterday you all heard a rant about EPCs. Today it's about PAS 2035. Which is great.
No, PAS 2030. Peter Rickaby is a lovely man, and PAS 2035 is a really good idea. As you say, I agree with you entirely, Nadia. It needs rewriting and it needs to be tweaked in light of the practicalities that people have faced. But the idea of having somebody that is a householder's effective clerk of works, but with enough technical know-how to look after the job, that's a really good idea. But the bit where I'm not allowed to do a retrofit design because I'm not an architect, which I used to be able to do, but I now can't under the terms of PAS 2035. That's nonsense. Where's the prior experience recognition that you should get on something like that? Or even other ways of doing it. We need to recognise that not everyone likes sitting on a webinar being lectured at.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of round up, I'm conscious of time, but you know, one of the things that we're looking at to tackle this problem is working with our local councils to actually have a forum where all of the people that are working in retrofit or all of the installers that are doing work in the area, and it's very important to do this on a local level, come together and have these conversations about why they're not doing retrofit and what they need to be able to get into it. Yeah, I guess Francesca, I'll pass back to you so you can stop us having this.
Thank you both very much.
I was getting a bit ranty there, so it's been
it's been fascinating listening to you both talk. You're both very knowledgeable on the subject. I wonder if I can give you each perhaps like a last minute just to say if you've got any key takeaways just for our audience about where they can get started. Perhaps we can wrap up with that and then say goodbye.
Key takeaways for me, I mean, it's great that, you know, some people in the audience have already got started on retrofit and are already doing things. I think when you start looking at this space, especially if you're joining, you know, webinars like ours, you'll hear a lot of frustration from people because it's an early industry and there's always sort of frustration on the barriers in industries that are you know, developing and are not widespread. But don't let that stop you from doing retrofit. There's lots you can do. It is very easy to get started, and you're doing the right thing already by joining webinars like this. So yeah, do have a look at your local groups and find out what they're doing, and yeah, just keep learning, keep talking to people, keep having those conversations about retrofit. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
I suppose I would just be leaving it on the next generation. I learned woodwork at school and it has informed how I still work today. The most my children got to make at school was bending a piece of plastic to make a pair of salad tongs. It really worries me that we're not training a generation in any manual skills that they might then be able to deploy in the absolutely enormous task in front of us. This needs to be treated as a wartime mobilization. We need to be getting people learning how to use tools, finding ways to learn how to use tools, and getting and starting at school. Let's get D&T made into something that's actually fit for the century that we're in and the emergency that we're in. So we're training the next generation of tradespeople, because so many are due to retire in the next 10 years. We're going to be even more stuck in 10 years this time. So I think that the crucial thing, I think the other thing, there are so many other parts that are as crucial, but I think the biggest one, the one that terrifies me more than anything else, is there's too many people talking about retrofit, but when you say, can I actually have one? They go, oh no, we're not doing that bit. And we're at the other end of the scale. I've got more retrofits than I know what to do with, but I can't get any people. There are too few people out there that can do a decent job for a decent day's work. They're just not here. They're the ones that I used to work with. A lot of them have gone back to Poland, but I just haven't been able to find the rest of them, because anyone that's any good is working flat out already on other things. And as Nadia said, they're working in jobs that are easy to make a living out of. But we have a desperate problem. We are going to radically miss our emissions reduction targets unless we get people excited and interested in some jobs in construction, and we need to start lobbying our schools and our colleges to make that more attractive.
Great. So keep having these conversations, and if you're enjoying them, maybe consider becoming a retrofitter yourself.
Yeah, get in touch.
Great, thank you so much, both of you, and for all those attending as well. I hope you found it useful, and good luck with all your retrofits as well.
Thanks
Cheers.
for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed it, everyone. I hope we didn't go on too much. Hopefully speak to some of you again.